It was useless to argue, and Lyddie gave up, hoping that the mood would pass, like her mother's times of craziness always had. But the next morning, her mother had not forgotten her determination. "If it ain't Clarissa's, it will soon be the poor farm," she said. The only charity Lyddie dreaded more than Aunt Clarissa's was that of the town's poor farm. It was to escape that specter that their father had headed west. "I can't stop you to go," Lyddie said. "But I can't go with you. I can't leave the farm." When her mother opened her mouth to argue, Lyddie went on. "The sow won't fetch enough to provide coach fare for the lot of us." She sent Charles along to make sure her mother and the babies arrived safely at Uncle Judah's farm. Charlie was a funny sight, hardly higher than a currant bush, but drawn up like a man in his worn boots and his father's old woolen shirt with the sleeves rolled. He loaded up the barrow. They sold the horse cart for seeds last year. "It's only 10 miles to Cutler's, where the coach stops. The little ones can ride when they get too tired," he said. He put in their mother's old skin trunk, which had carried her meager trousseau to this mountain, and most of the food she'd managed to preserve before she gave up trying. Between them, he and Lyddie wrestled the old sow to the ground and tied her, squealing, to a shaft of the barrow. "You want I should go with you as far as the village?" she asked him. But they agreed it would be better for her to tend the cows and horse and protect the house from the wild critters. "You watch out for yourself," he said anxiously. "I'll do fine," she said. "Now remember, you've got to get enough for the pig to pay coach fare for everyone." "And for me to come back again," he said, as a promise that she would not be left alone on the mountain farm. He glanced about to make sure his mother wasn't in hearing distance. "You mustn't be afraid to go down and ask the Quaker Stevens for help, Lyddie. They mean to be good neighbors to us, no matter what Mama says." "Well, I'll see how it goes, she said, tossing her thin plaits behind her shoulders. He should know she was not going to be beholden to the neighbors for anything so trivial as her own comfort. Their mother didn't approve of heathens or abolitionists, and since she considered the Quaker neighbors a bit of both, she forbade the children to have anything to do with the Stevenses. "Ain't no worthin' gonna have truck with the devil," she said. Early last summer, when Mama was having one of her spells and not paying much attention, Charlie had again sneaked the cow down the mountain to the Stevens's place. As long as Lyddie could remember, long before their father had left, they had made use of the Stevens's bull. If their mother ever wondered about those calves that were born like miracles every spring, she never mentioned it. She knew as well as Lyddie and Charles that they could never have managed without the cash money those calves brought in. Lyddie didn't care one way or the other about the neighbors' radical ideas and peculiar ways. She minded mightily being beholden. It couldn't be helped. The use of a bull was a necessity she couldn't manage on her own. But she would starve to death rather than go begging before this year's calf was safely born and it was time to mate the cow once more. She needn't have worried. Charlie came back in about 2 weeks, and together they made it through the winter. They shot rabbits and peeled bark for soup to eke out their scarce provisions. They ran out of flour for bread, so the churn stood idle. "But I never craved churning," said Lyddie. When the time for the calving drew near, they reluctantly let the cow go dry. They had no need for butter without any bread, but they missed the milk and cheese sorely. Nonetheless, they were farmers enough to do what was best for their only cow. The calf was born to great rejoicing and a new abundance of milk and cream. Lyddie and Charles felt rich as townsfolk. A sweet little heifer she was, arriving on the first warm day of March, the same day that they bored holes in the sugar maples and inserted the spills that they had made to catch the sap flows. They were able to make enough syrup and sugar for themselves. Hardly enough for a cash crop, but they were learning, and in another year, after another harvest, they would be experienced old farmers and sugarers, they told each other. Years later, she would remember that morning. The late May sky was brilliant, dare you to wink blue, and the cheek of the hillside wore a 3-day growth of green. High in one of the apple trees, a bluebird warbled his full spring song. Chirra, weera, weewit, cheerily, cheerily. Lyddie's own spirit rose in reply. Her rough hands were stretched to grasp the satin-smooth wooden shafts of the old plow. With Charles's and the horse's head, they urged and pushed the heavy metal blade through the rocky earth. The plow cast up the clean, damp smell of new-turned soil. Cheerily, cheerily! Then, into that perfect spring morning, a horse and rider had come around the narrow curve of the road. Slowly, the horse gingerly picked its way across the deep, dried ruts of mud left from the thaws of April and early May. Charlie, she said quietly, hardly daring to move, because for a moment she hoped it might be Papa, but only for a moment. It was plainly a woman riding side saddle, and not their mother either. She never rode since she fell years ago and miscarried the baby that would have come between Lyddie and Charles. Charlie, Lyddie repeated. Someone's coming. Mrs. Peck, for she was the rider. She brought a letter from the general store in the village. I thought you might be wanting this, she said. Lyddie fetched the coins for the postage from their almost empty cash box. The shopkeeper's wife waited a bit, hoping, perhaps, that Lyddie would read the letter aloud. But she didn't. Lyddie was not much of a reader, so it was later, the short wisps of hair around her face plastered with sweat, that she held the letter close to the fire and managed to make out the words in her mother's cramped and painfully childish hand. Dear Lyddie, the world have not come to an end yet, but we can still hope. Meantime, I have hired you out to Mr. Cutler at the tavern, and for your brother to the baker's mill. The pasture, fields, and sugar bush is lent to Mr. Westcott to repay debts, also cow and horse. Leave at once you get this. Your loving mother, Mattie M. Worthen. Lyddie burst into tears. I'm sorry, Charlie, she said to her brother's amazed and anxious face. I never expected this. We were doing so good, eh? You and me. He took a deep breath, reached in his pocket, and handed her a ragged kerchief. It's all right, Lyddie, he said. It's all right. When she kept her tear-streaked face buried in his kerchief, he gave one of her braids a tweak. The world have not come to an end yet, eh? He took the letter from her lap, and when she wiped her face and tried to smile, he grinned anxiously and pointed to their mother's primitive spelling. See, we can still hop. Lyddie laughed uncertainly. Her spelling was no better than their mother's, so she did not really see the joke at first. But Charlie laughed, and so she began to laugh, though it was the kind of laughter that caught like briars in her chest and felt very much like pain. That is the end of chapter 1.